This sermon begins in 1995. It's my senior year of college, and I am taking a Principles of Economics class. I do this not because I genuinely want to, but because I fear that my father might disinherit me if I graduate college without knowing how to balance a checkbook. I step into the lecture hall trepidatiously, but I'm immediately captivated by my professor. His core thesis is that literally everything happening in the world can be understood through an economic analysis. And he proves this again and again by choosing random headlines from the New York Times and offering his economist take on the news story. So we work our way through Mississippi ratifying the 13th Amendment, yes, officially and legally abolishing slavery 130 years after the Civil War, and massacres in Chechnya, and the Oklahoma City bombing, all through an economic lens. We look at earthquakes and other natural disasters, learning how underlying economic forces explain why certain disasters wreak such disproportionate devastation. It is exhilarating. I almost regret taking the class pass-fail. And then, on the last day of the semester, our professor stands before us and says that he has a confession to make. I have argued, he says, that nothing is beyond the scope of an economic analysis, but that's not really true. There is one thing in life that fundamentally challenges the economist's worldview, and that, he says, is love. He goes on to explain that there is simply no way for an economist to understand why a human being would drive for hours at great expense and profound inconvenience to hold the hand or gently touch the cheek of the person they love for just a few precious moments. And yet any person who has ever been in love knows that you would take that trip in a heartbeat. That lecture was decades ago, but as I think about the life lessons that move through you and those that live in you, that one stuck. It planted for me at 21 the seed that there is a great, mysterious, incalculable force in the universe that overrides all principles, defies all logic, and upends all reason, and it is available to every single one of us. I'm obviously not speaking here only of romantic love. Think of the love of a parent to their newborn, or of one friend who guides another through breast cancer. Think of the love of a really good teacher for his student, like the 5th grade teacher in Virginia who, when his student's shoe broke just as he was about to walk across the stage for elementary school graduation, took off his own shoes and handed them to the child. That kind of love is the backdrop for this sermon. Experts say that we are living today through what's called the polycrisis, the phenomenon in which multiple crises converge, magnifying and compounding the consequences of each one. So consider, for example, what it means that the climate crisis is unfolding amid the global rise of authoritarianism. Think, for example, of January 2025, which will go down in history as the frightful intersection of wildfire, ceasefire, and dumpster fire, right? A deep dive into the polycrisis is enough to keep anyone up at night, but I also find it oddly comforting because it gives language to a deep inner truth. Because the polycrisis is not only external to us, it's not only about the end of the liberal world order converging with the threat of extinction from our near future robotic overlords. The worry today is multilateral. It's personal and it's political. It's local, it's national, it's global. It's the reason that when someone says, "How are you?" it's so difficult to offer a simple answer these days. Today is Yom Kippur. I just want to invite you to close your eyes for a moment and think about the pain point that is closest to your heart. Maybe you ache today for someone you have lost. Or you're worried about your health, or your finances, or you're lonely. Now think of your immediate circle, your family and your friends, and add to your internal ledger the work that you would need to do for healing to happen there, the way you use up all your energy at work and bring only your exhaustion and frustration home to your partner, and I'm sorry for that. But I know I'm not the only one. The friend you know is not at all okay, but you don't have the bandwidth to engage as you should. And then think about the next circle, this city, this beautiful city. I'm talking about where the heartache lives inside of you. What did it feel like to hear about masked men disappearing workers from the car wash down the street? I'm talking about people working double shifts at minimum wage to provide basic sustenance for their families. And what about those fires and the toll that continues to reverberate through the community now nearly a year later? Add that to your internal ledger too. And now think about our nation, if you dare. Where does the loss live in you when you witness the anticipatory obedience? If they don't put up a fight, how am I supposed to? When artifacts that are perceived to disparage America are scrubbed from our museums, how will our nation heal if we don't reckon with our past? What about when Jewish pain is exploited to cut funding for cancer research in our great universities? When children are now dying unnecessarily from measles in Texas and the whooping cough in Louisiana? And now enlarge your circle of concern even more. Where does Israel live in your heart right now? And Gaza, the broken and the bereaved, the hopeless and the helpless, and beyond that to Ukraine and Sudan, and make a mental note of it all. Your ledger tells the story of a polycrisis too, a deeply personal, spiritual polycrisis. Polycrises, internal and external, can easily and perhaps reasonably lead to a sense of overwhelm and desperation, which easily and perhaps reasonably contribute to a sense of helplessness and despair. But I sometimes think about that moment at the First National Conference on Religion and Race in Chicago, a multi-faith gathering in 1963, when one white minister after another rose to declare that it was simply too late for America to chart a new course toward racial equality. But then Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel stood up, and he took the microphone and he said, "With all respect, my friends, in my tradition, there is no sin greater than the sin of despair." So if despair is a luxury that we cannot afford, what then? Thankfully, there are scholars and practitioners devising strategies for how we might survive all of these intersecting crises. And the answers, as you can imagine, are as complex as the questions. We must build transformative resiliency and mechanisms of coordination across sectors, these sorts of things. But as I read more deeply into the polycrisis, I am becoming convinced that the more complex the question, the simpler the answer must be. Now, David and I went to a conference in Kyoto in the spring with leaders in high tech and AI. And there we learned about some truly humbling and astonishing advancements in medical and climate science, like advanced cancer detection and AI-assisted surgeries. But I was struck by one repeated chorus throughout the sessions. How can we make the machines more human? By this, they meant, is consciousness possible for computer systems? How can we train them to think and feel more like people? How far are we from super intelligence? Now, I was invited there along with a Buddhist priest and a professor of philosophy to share my observations and ethical concerns. What guidance could our ancient tradition offer as this technological cyclone blasts through the landscape of the world as we knew it? If the technology really is an inevitability, which it apparently is, what should leaders in the field keep in mind to ensure that it is developed and used responsibly? Of course, I had many concerns, mostly about the danger of the breakneck pace of the technological advancement and the fact that it's being driven primarily by people whose main interest was not saving the planet and its inhabitants, but in turning their billions into trillions, words that I actually heard said aloud. And perhaps most centrally, what will happen to the human beings who are already being outpaced, displaced, and replaced by these superhuman technologies? But what I said first and foremost is this. I have sat here for days listening to you say that your greatest challenge is how to make the machines more human. But my greatest challenge is how to make the humans more human. That remains not only my primary concern, but the very essence of the work of Yom Kippur. And it may also be the question that will help us navigate the polycrisis. What can we do to help humans become more human? It's this question that brings me to Homeboy Industries to sit with Father Greg Boyle, a friend, a Jesuit priest running the largest gang rehabilitation and reentry program in the world. Just a rabbi days before High Holy Days heading downtown in search of something my heart tells me I will find at the corner of Bruno and Alameda. I've been to Homeboy many times before, but this is my first time there since ICE raids drew a wave of terror through our city this summer. I'm relieved to see so many people milling around outside, especially since some of our neighborhoods have become ghost towns since June. As I pull in, there are 4 guys, likely former gang members, sweeping the sidewalk in front of Homeboy. They appear not at all annoyed when they have to step aside for me to pull in. They seem proud of their work. One of them is teaching a small boy, I'm guessing his son, to hold the broom and sweep, sweep, sweep. And the boy is super excited to show me what he has learned. I am overwhelmed with the sense that we, these guys and I, are on the same side of history, the grateful side, the striving side. Inside, the place is abuzz with energy, young men, women with babies, all patiently waiting for a few minutes with Father G. When it's my turn, I'm ushered into his office. I tell him I've been ruminating on something I heard him say back in the spring at Nomi Ackerman's event for Odvot, something that felt urgent and revelatory to me. Here's what he said. The only thing that can bridge any distance ever is love. We must choose love as our home. I need to understand that, Father G, I say. How do we make love our home in times like these when literally everything feels like it's breaking at once? So Father G explains the heart of his work at Homeboy. Homies say that they're used to being watched, not being seen, he says. So our work is to see them. When you see someone through the eyes of love, he says, it changes the way that they see themselves. It has to. And I'm telling you, I feel it in my body. I fully understand why the guys out front were so honored to be sweeping that sidewalk. Homeboy, they say, is the front porch of the house that everyone wants to live in. Well, I want to live in that house too. In the upside down world we all now inhabit, that place is right side up. As I drive back to the office, I remember that Father Greg once described our community, IKAR, as that front porch too. What an honor and what a high bar for us to strive toward. And I'm thinking about what it means to build a place of true belonging, a place where each person feels that they are seen through the eyes of love. And I think about how that love, a love so great it surpasses the comprehension of even the most brilliant economist, reaches inside of us and transforms us. And I realize that Father Greg has helped me understand a textual conundrum that I've been wrestling with for the past few months. My problem emerges from a text in 2 Samuel, chapters 11 and 12. This is the story of King David and the Prophet Natan, a story so dark, so gripping, so seductive that Leonard Cohen had to write a song about it. While King David's troops are off fighting a bloody war with Ammon, the king is luxuriating in his palace in Jerusalem. One day, he goes out for a stroll on his roof, and he sees the beautiful Bathsheba bathing in her home. Now, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, is away at war. So David sends for her. He sleeps with her. The text does not indicate that she consents to this arrangement. Weeks later, Bathsheba notifies the king that she's pregnant, and David, desperate to cover up his sin, hatches a cynical plan. He grants Uriah, the husband, a brief respite from war, expecting that after spending the night with his wife, he'll assume that the yet-to-be-born child is his own. But you see, David underestimates Uriah, who repeatedly refuses to go home to Bathsheba. The ark and Israel and Judah and all of our soldiers are out at war, he says. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? Absolutely not. A frustrated King David sends Uriah back to the front, instructing Yoav, his general, to have Uriah killed in battle. And Yoav does as he's told. Everyone around David generally does, sending back word to the king that the matter has been resolved. Uriah is dead. And David, the great King David, heart of stone, replies, "Do not be distressed that men died in this operation. The sword always takes its toll." David is relieved. Bathsheba grieves. When her period of mourning ends, the two marry, and their child is born. But God is displeased with all that David has done. This is when Natan, a prophet of David's court, approaches the king to rebuke him. And he does so by telling David a story. There were two men, one wealthy and one very poor. The rich one had abundant flocks and herds, but the poor one had but one small, precious lamb, which he tended to with great care. The poor man treated that lamb like one of his own children, loving and caring for it, sharing with it what little food and drink he had. One day, a traveler came to visit the rich man, but he was loath to take from his own flock to prepare a meal. So he went out and grabbed and then slaughtered the poor man's lamb in order to feed the guest. When David hears this story, he flies into a fit of rage against the rich man, insisting on the most severe punishment. The man must pay both for what he's done and for the fact that he had no compassion as he did it, says David. And this is when Natan points a finger at David, the king, and says, "Atah ha'ish, you are that man." David is stunned by these words. He's transformed. Chatati l'Adonai, he says, "I'm guilty before God." David is still punished. The child born of this union with Bathsheba dies. But after a second grieving period, they have another baby, Solomon, who will succeed his father as king. I was drawn back to this story this season as I wrestled with some big, perplexing questions of our time. How is it that good people sometimes behave in utterly repugnant ways? From where does a person draw the strength to rebuke the king when everyone else around him capitulates? And how does one effectively stand in opposition to callous, reckless, narcissistic rulers? That's what drove me to the text. But on the 10, driving west from my meeting with Father Greg, I realized that the story has come to teach me something even more important about how to navigate these deeply troubling times. The real question is this: what does it take to awaken a person's conscience, to help them see the world and themselves from a different vantage point? And here it becomes deeply significant that Natan chooses, despite the urgency and the intensity of his rebuke, to offer a parable, to tell a story. Why not just point a finger at the king and shout rape, murder, shame? Because when David hears about the wealthy man stealing from his poor neighbor, it immediately becomes clear to him there must be a consequence both for what the man did and for the fact that he had no compassion as he did it. Natan understands that in order for David to take responsibility for his actions, his compassion must be awakened. And you cannot shout or shame someone into an awakening of compassion. The parable gives David some space from his own story. Hearing about the two men, he immediately remembers that he has a moral core. He is outraged by the wealthy man and his abominable behavior. And it's not just that it is objectively awful for the rich man to take what little that poor man has. You see, before he was king, David was a shepherd. He knew what it meant to love and care for especially vulnerable creatures. That softness, that humanity still lives deep inside him. He just needed to be reminded of it. As Father Greg says, when you see someone through the eyes of love, it changes the way they see themselves. This is how we make humans more human. I went to the story of Natan and David because I wanted to understand how we must approach kings. What I learned is how we must approach one another and ourselves, not with rage and shame and blame, where we might naturally incline when overwhelmed, but with honesty and humanity, with tenderness and with love. Believe me, I understand the rage response. What is unfolding at breakneck speed all around us is definitionally outrageous. And rage could seem like the productive flip side of despair. I'm not giving up. Look at how hard I'm fighting. And at the same time, it is clear to me that we cannot scream our way through the polycrisis. The problems are simply too vast and the stakes are simply too high. And outrage alone will not sustain us. Because as Father Greg says, outrage feels good. But at the end of the day, it's really just self-congratulatory. It does nothing to heal our broken world. To quote Margaret Rankel, fury is a powerful motivator of resistance, but there's only so much rage a person can harbor without nurturing something cold and still and hard in the place where a warm, living heart once beat. Father Greg and Rankel are keying into an important truth, one of my most pressing worries in our time. The age of rage is permeating our spirits, and it's beginning to override our most human instinct, the ability to empathize, to identify with, to connect with one another's humanity. To be clear, I am not standing here issuing a call for civility, which is too often a cynical code for surrender. But I fear that today our white-hot fury is becoming not our strength, but our kryptonite, leaving us bitter and callous and empty, all while poisoning the ecosystem of good and decent people who will need to work together if we are to survive the many grave challenges of our time. A decade ago, after an election that shook many of us to the core, not only for what it was, but for what it portended for this country for generations to come, I stood here and challenged our community to build in this place an oasis of love and justice. As the world was becoming more callous, we would need to become more compassionate. We would have to take great care not to be swept up in the culture of aggrievement and aggression, and instead work on being more patient, more present, more empathic. That did not mean that we would capitulate. On the contrary, it was a recognition that we would have to root our resistance in a strength that we could only build together. We would have to create places of sacred belonging, islands of care and connection. And that is even more true now, a decade later. Today, the cruelty is the point, and it is we who must offer a counterpoint. In Hilchot Deot, Rambam teaches that one must respond to an extreme character flaw by leaning toward the opposite extreme. So a person who's struggling with greed needs to practice excessive generosity. Someone who's prone to arrogance needs to practice excessive humility. So too, I would argue with the dominant cultural climate. In a time of unbridled hostility, we must practice staying tender. In a culture of dogmatic certainty, we must cultivate intellectual curiosity. How do we build pockets of humanity in an increasingly inhumane world? How can we continue to turn to one another with open hearts, with human hearts, with loving hearts, when everything hurts so much all at once? The bigger the problem, the simpler the answer. It has to be tenderness. It has to be love. The kind of love that we are talking about today is not some sentimental distraction while the world burns in the polycrisis. It is love as the transformational agent in reawakening our moral imagination. It is love that lets us tell a new story about ourselves and about each other, a story that creates the space for a new moral understanding. Love doesn't mean retreating from the fight. It's love that reminds us that we have something to fight for. And what does that robust, muscular love look like in public in times like these? It looks like never turning away from our neighbor's pain, even when we are hurting too. And I know it's hard to hold it all, but God gave us capacious hearts for a reason. It means practicing grace and choosing humility and curiosity and compassion. It means standing with and for one another, even when formidable forces work to wedge us apart. It means being brave in big public ways when we can, and in smaller, quieter ways too, even when we're hurt and tired and scared. It means being vulnerable, weeping together, laughing together, singing and making art together, even on the hardest and darkest days. It means that as the spiritual landscape of our time becomes ever more barren, we invest in learning how to draw deeply from the inner wells of spiritual strength. It means remembering, even from the epicenter of the storm, that the world is not only broken, but also profoundly beautiful. And it means remembering that this storm will pass, because all storms eventually pass. And when it does, we will rise up and look out over the wreckage of our time, and we will tend to one another's wounds, and we will begin to rebuild. Today is Yom Kippur, our annual invitation to take a whole precious day and hold up a mirror to ourselves. When we do that, we may see all kinds of things we wish we didn't, like wrinkles and blemishes and imperfections. That's part of the work here, you see. But by the time the sun starts to set tonight, it is my deepest prayer that we will see ourselves not only through our own eyes, but through God's eyes. Eyes that penetrate the surface and see to the depths. Eyes that love and cherish us for exactly what we are, perfectly imperfect humans. I don't know if this makes sense through an economic analysis, but I know it to be deeply true. There's a reason that we are dizzy and floating by the end of the day today, our feet more off the ground than on. And it is not only because of this fast. It is because we have finally, after 25 hours of our focused attention and genuine effort, allowed ourselves to be seen through the mighty eyes of love. We have finally chosen love as our home. And that choice is what changes everything. Because once we have been made tender, we can choose to stay tender. We can choose to live even through the age of rage, even through the polycrisis, even through the stormiest days ahead, from that place of love. And I hope and I pray that we will. Gemar Chatima Tova.